Professor Debra Skene. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'm going to start this episode by doing my best to embarrass you. You were very generous in trying to involve me in things during my PhD, even though we were only weakly affiliated through Eurith Dyer. So thank you very much for that. And also, it's probably worth noting that to this day, the one paper that I've written that's been cited a few times is a review article that we wrote together. And had we not written it together, there's no way that it would have got into a prestigious journal. So thank you for being you and for everything that you do and for helping me out, frankly, at a time of need.
Yeah, that was a great review. It was really detailed, but we've had lots of compliments from that, and I think a lot of people have read it. In fact, it's always more effective if you can put different experts, and you had experts with your PhD, and we were the sort of chronobiology experts. I think it worked really well. Yeah, it stands, and it's been well cited.
So on the subject of chronobiology, we're going to be mostly
Yeah.
discussing shift work today. And I thought it would make sense to start by clarifying some terms. And shift work has been variously defined, but we can think of it as periodically or permanently working outside of conventional hours. And depending on who you speak to, that might be between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. or between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. But with that background, I'd like to introduce listeners to some of the health and safety consequences of shift work. There are famous examples of things going wrong during night shifts. Events like the disaster at Chernobyl come to mind. So maybe we could start by the safety consequences. Could you give us an idea of the degree to which shift work increases risk of accidents, as well as the types of shifts that might be most problematic? And by that, I mean it might be that, for example, longer shifts are more likely to cause accidents than shorter ones.
Yes, I think if we're talking about shift work, as you say, the any work that occurs outside of normal hours, sort of 9 to 5, if we're looking at which particularly ones are bad for performance, and therefore you might be more sleepy, less vigilant, and have an accident, and that can, of course, have grave consequences to yourself if you're driving a car, or to other people if you're in control of a nuclear power plant. And so that would be the night shift, would be the most dangerous, and that would be working anytime from midnight to 6 or 7 in the morning, because we know from our knowledge of circadian biology, and probably we'll go into that in a bit more detail, that your most risky time to be less alert and to be able to be more prone to accidents is just after when your core body temperature minimum is. And for normal people who have normal sort of chronotypes, that's about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So around that time is where your performance is at its nadir. Your reaction time is really long if you do reaction time tests. You're struggling to stay awake, and that would be the sort of red danger zone in terms of performance.
Hmm. And you mentioned the core body temperature, Nadir, there. That tends to be
Yeah.
roughly 2 hours before the time at which somebody would naturally wake in the morning. And then to add some numbers regarding the degree to which shift work seems to increase risk of accidents. Depending on the study that you look at, there seems to be something like a 50 to 100% higher risk of certain accidents. And that risk seems to go up with longer shifts. So if, for example, someone is working a shift that's over 10 hours or so, and you mentioned driving performance, I know that there's some work in junior doctors in the UK, trainee anaesthetists. I think 57% of them reported either falling asleep or being on the verge of falling asleep while driving home after a night shift. So clearly, this is something that really can be quite burdensome.
Yeah. And, of course, if you study clocks, biological clocks, the way I do, we like to focus on sort of circadian clock misalignment, but we mustn't forget that the other component of shift work is sleep deprivation. And so we've got sort of two elements to the problem. We've got this immediate effect of acute sleep deprivation. 4 o'clock in the morning, you've probably been awake for from the morning before, so you've been awake a lot. So after 16 hours of being awake, your risk of having accidents increases, and by that time you've got this sort of perfect storm of your circadian system being at its most risky, your core body temperature minimum, plus you've got this accumulating sleep debt, and these hours are just adding up, and you need sleep, and so it really is the risky time.
And I'd like to come back to the degree to which circadian misalignment seems to contribute to some of these problems that we see in shift workers. But if we move on to more direct effects on health, what are some of the health problems that shift workers are disposed to? And I wonder if you could give some examples of the size of those changes in risk relative to non-shift workers.
Most obvious, I think, is what we've discussed already, because that you can feel. The minute anybody goes on a night shift, you can feel reduced alertness, poorer performance, and trouble sleeping when you want to sleep the next day. So initially, these were the most reported side effects of shift work, because so sleep problems, reduce sleep by a lot. If we think that if our normal average sleep is 7 to 8 hours, shift workers are more like 5 to 6 hours. So you've got this accumulating chronic sleep deprivation. What's been harder to put our fingers on is what sleep deprivation and circadian misalignment are doing to our body, for example, to our metabolism, because we don't have sensors telling us that our liver clock isn't metabolizing the right way. We don't have any symptom of that. So I think some of the other adverse effects of shift work weren't initially obvious, but it was just with a lot of research, with many people doing lots of shift work over many years, the data on this is accumulating. And initially, the data came from, classic epidemiological studies, so very large cohorts of shift workers, where they assessed the diseases that these shift workers had compared to people who've never worked a shift, so healthy controls versus shift workers. And there is now enormous amount of epidemiological data showing the increased risk that shift work brings to, for example, if we're talking about metabolic diseases, you first of all increased a tendency to be obese, increased tendency to type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. But the other big adverse health effect that came about, and in fact was the first signal to all of us that shift work was carried these sort of chronic adverse health consequences, and those were initially breast cancer that was done in a very large US nurses study, and then after that prostate cancer. So it was cancers and these other metabolic diseases that I think are on top of the list when it comes to adverse consequences. Now, people have done meta-analyses and their reviews on that, and they can calculate the sort of the increased risk that you may have. So it isn't necessarily that when you do shift work you will get cancer or you will have type 2 diabetes, but it just increases the risk.
Yeah. And depending on the particular meta-analysis that you look at, the size of those increases in risk seem to be of the order of 5 to 25% for cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. You spoke about cancer, and I know that the International Agency for Research on Cancer has deemed night shift work a probable carcinogen in humans on the basis of all that epidemiology that you were speaking about. And there are also some preliminary studies suggesting that shift workers might be at greater risk of some diseases that might not be so obvious. There was a big study of the UK Biobank published by Frank Shear and some others suggesting that shift workers might be prone to asthma, for instance. And then nowadays, everybody seems to be fascinated by aging. And I know that there's tentative evidence suggesting that maybe people who do rotating shifts or night shifts are aging at an accelerated rate, going by some of these proxies of biological aging that we have, but we need to bear in mind the limitations of those. But one of your own studies, Deborah, that I found particularly interesting is a case series that you published 4 years ago with Claudia Moreno. Is looking at whether night working pregnant women are more prone to complications late in pregnancy, and then subsequently whether their offspring are disposed to problems too. Could you tell us about that work?
Thank you, and I agree with everything that you've said there. This is a sort of new avenue of research that quite a few people are looking at now, in terms of shift work and risk to pregnancy and some sort of risk to the newborn. So I think we'll see more and more papers out about that. Ours was quite an early first study. My collaborator, Claudia Moreno, works at Institute of Public Health at Sao Paulo University. And there in Brazil, women are allowed to work and do shifts during pregnancy. Now, that isn't necessarily the case for all countries, but because we had pregnant nurses working night shifts, we thought this was the time to begin to look at that. We tried to measure their melatonin rhythms in the urine to see where their circadian clock was. And we also made recordings of their progress during their pregnancy. And then again, looking at the weight of the newborn, and other studies, including animal studies, have suggested that there is an increased risk of miscarriage in shift workers. But they do these experiments also in animals where they put them under sort of shift work schedules. I wouldn't want to say that we definitely can put a firm number on what sort of increased risk you have there, but I would really think we need to do more work. And it might be the case going forward that indeed we don't allow women who are pregnant at a certain time in their pregnancy, that they should actually stop doing shift work, because it is a stress to the body, whether it's a sleep deprivation stress or a circadian clock misalignment stress, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
I understand that you found that night shift working women were more likely to have assisted delivery, and also they had lower nighttime melatonin production, so there seemed to be some potential disruption to their melatonin rhythms, which are, of course, a helpful proxy of the function of their body's clocks. And you looked at the infants too, finding that the newborns had a lower APGAR index. That's a score of 0 to 10 that basically looks at 5 really important signs of their vitality, and higher scores are better, of course. So the suggestion based on this work that you did is that maybe both mums and their little ones are a little bit worse off if they're working night shifts compared to their day working counterparts.
That's right. as I say, I think it's an important early study, but I'd like more done to get more numbers, and so I think that's one of the avenues that they will pursue in Brazil. Keep looking at that hospital.
Hmm. I know around this time you published a hypothesis article in Medical Hypotheses discussing potential roles of
Ah,
melatonin in intrauterine programming and specifically metabolic programming. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
yes, well, it's largely based on animal work, and then we knowing what we've learned from the effects of melatonin, uh, and its possible effects on metabolism, and then sort of we tried to project that to what the mechanism that might be happening uh, in pregnancy and in shift work. So indeed, yeah, I always liked that journal. For many years, I used to track it because you kind of get some interesting ideas where people are picking up some of the literature and putting it together to suggest that this might be worth looking at more, which was the whole object of the article, hoping that other people will, find some funding and look at these aspects, because I still think these are, under researched aspects. But I'm aware of other groups now, in America, for example, looking at shift workers and pregnancy. So it's not over. I don't think we've got. I don't know if I'm not sure if the UK Biobank will deliver on that aspect.
Mm.
Um, but it might. The problem with the UK Biobank, when you actually go into the question that was asked about shift work, it's a blunt tool because
Mhm.
they have to ask, very short questions, and it can often be something like, do you work more than 3 nights a month? And that's their definition of shift work. So, and then they're characterized on that basis. Uh, the early nurses study, it was exactly a question like that. And of course, you and me know that there are a lot more sort of subtle and complicated questions about shift work that we would like to know about. And it often becomes a very blunt question in epidemiology studies. So I think going forward, if we could have more information about the type of shift work that the participants have undertaken, whether it was rotating shifts or whether it was just night work, or whether it was a rotating shift in a clockwise direction or rotating shift in a anti-clockwise direction, and particularly for how long had they been doing shift work, and whether they'd had intermittent breaks, but of course that's a lot of questions, and these big epidemiology studies don't like 20 questions on shift work. That's the
No.
issue.
It reminds me of those
Yeah,
types of studies where people get asked about their chronotype, for example. Are you definitely a morning person? And so on. And maybe there are five different options, and it really does only tell you so
yeah,
much.
that's it.
Categorical variables only get you so far, and continuous ones be preferable, but we have to make do with what we have. And then going back to medical
Hmm.
hypotheses, it sounds like that's a helpful resource for budding scientists to brainstorm future research ideas. I was curious about whether you're familiar with any research on night shift working women and their offspring, and specifically whether their offspring's clocks become functional at a later stage than those of women who don't work nights. Because when newborns arrive in the world, their sleep wake patterns, of course, are somewhat disorganized, and they emerge into coherent cycles over the course of several weeks. And when they're in the womb, their main time cues include things like what's arriving via the placenta. And then when out in the world, their time cues include things like what's coming from mum's milk, given that there is melatonin in mum's milk. And so if their mothers have disrupted rhythms, it would make sense that their own rhythms might only become coherent at a later stage than those of mothers who have sharper light dark cycles, activity rest cycles, and eating fasting cycles.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we don't know the answer. Um, the problem being is about how do you track or how do you measure, clocks in offspring and newborn, without being too non-invasive, and so. Because it all makes absolute sense what you've said. It's a great hypothesis that could be tested. Um, but in terms of sampling from newborns, we'd be looking at non-invasive technologies, maybe saliva sampling, urine sampling. Then you've got urine in nappies, and you have to spin down the nappies to get the urine, and then you're measuring the melatonin metabolite
Lucky
in
PhD
nappies,
students.
which we've done before. Yeah, and has been done before, and we've done it before. Uh, uh, of course, you could track temperature, but that can be affected by quite a lot of other things. But you would be looking for some sort of non-invasive sampling, tracking the newborn, and at the same time the mother, and to see how that compares with a good healthy group. So yeah, we could sit here and design quite a good study. I'm pleased to say that in terms of circadian biology, we are getting better at what I would call ambulatory tracking of biological clocks, meaning tracking clocks when people are living in the real world, in their real lives, rather than them having to come to the lab. So that's a big push forward. And I'm collaborating currently with Professor Stafford Lightman at the University of
Mm.
Bristol, and he's designed a really interesting device that you just literally wear around your stomach like one of these money pouches when you go traveling. And in that device, there's a pump, and it draws uh, tissue samples from your stomach. It's a painless,
Mm.
stress-free operation, but these little bits of fluid coming out of your stomach get stored in this device, and then we can take this out and find the samples in the device, and we can then measure melatonin, cortisol, and we're also measuring metabolites in this interstitial tissue. And it means then we can track, somebody's life for up to 27 hours, all day, all night, while they're sleeping, while they're eating, while they're working. And he has trialed that on younger children. Going forward, this is the kind of these are the kind of devices and sensors that could really be used for the experiment that you're suggesting.
Mhm. And the subject of continuous glucose monitoring and other things that you could monitor around the clock, whether those are
Mhm.
ketones or lactate or amino acids that are relevant to metabolism and metabolic health, has come up previously and I think holds a lot of promise, particularly in research context, but also in people who are trying to ward off or manage metabolic diseases. Going back to something that came up earlier, I'd love your thoughts on the degree to which circadian misalignment contributes to some of these problems that we see in shift workers. There's lots of
Mm.
experimental evidence looking at various different types of circadian misalignment protocols, such as forced desynchrony protocols. And Deborah, I did a two-part series on biological clocks and rhythms previously, in which I started to outline some of these concepts and how people can better understand people's rhythms and what contributes to fluctuations in their daily biology. So, given those differences that we see between shift workers and non-shift workers, how much do you think the circadian system disruption is contributing versus the stress that these people experience, maybe as a result of differences in capital, differences in psychosocial stress because they're trying to maintain healthy relationships with loved ones who don't necessarily work shifts themselves. There are all sorts of factors that could contribute to health disparities. And then, as you said, there are probably differences in sleep too that might drive some of these differences independent of any effects on the circadian clock.
It's the $1 million question. People at conferences, we still ask that question. What is the proportion of the contribution? It's likely to be quite large, the circadian misalignment, because it happens immediately. Your first night of night shift, your melatonin thinks you're sleeping, it peaks at night, and you're at work, and maybe eating. So on night one, your peripheral clocks and your behavior and your sleep wake and your feeding fasting is misaligned from your master clock, and so it happens straight away. The hard part, well, we can design, and somebody did. There's a fantastic experiment and paper that Raquel Leprold from Brazil designed. She had two protocols where she had exactly the same amount of sleep deprivation, but in one you had circadian misalignment as well, and in the other you didn't. And it turned out, so the heading of that paper is circadian misalignment, contributes more than sleep deprivation to the markers that she looked at. And that was in immune marker and some metabolic markers. And so I think we need more of those experiments. It's a beautifully designed, but at least we got the sense that the circadian misalignment can be more primary than the sleep deprivation on the markers she measured. The idea, though, about shift work and that to address the socio-psychology stress part of shift workers, is of course a lot harder. It's harder to get hard measurements on that. Yeah, we can ask questionnaires and we could ask people to rate themselves. But in the end, I suppose whether you're a willing shift worker, because some shift workers do shift work because it suits their lives, so they can do childcare things during the day, and they're still then able to work and earn money. So it's often an economical choice. You get paid more working night shifts. The oil rig workers that we used to study in the North Sea, they're out there for 3-4 weeks at a time on the oil rigs. Why do they do it? Mainly for the money, and then the large amount of leave you get once you get back home. So there are definitely incentives as well for people doing shift work. So it isn't necessarily all stress. It can often be a choice. So maybe the experiment would be studying shift workers who are stressed and don't like their job versus shift workers who aren't stressed, to try and pull those apart. But I think it's really hard to try and equate the clear psychology component to shift work and what that might contribute compared to the sort of physiological disruptions that we've been talking about. That's a real challenge.
I'll mention two things. One is that you've done some of these types of circadian disruption protocols yourself, and you published a very interesting study in PNAS in 2018 that I might link to in the show notes because it's a really good example of what we're discussing. And then also you've done some work, if I recall correctly, looking at drivers, suggesting that drivers who work shifts might have more reactive branches of the sympathetic nervous system in general, which suggests that maybe these people are experiencing increased stress in general, whether you ask them or whether you're actually looking at some physiological proxy of that.
Yeah, Yeah, that study that you mentioned there, Greg, was also done with my collaborator Claudia Moreno in Brazil, truck drivers. In Brazil, a lot of the products and goods between cities are transported via trucks. It's a big, big, big industry, a lot bigger, I think, than in Europe and the UK. So they don't have many train systems. So the truck driving industry is just amazing. And Claudia had access to these truck drivers that they interviewed, in addition to um, um, taking some measures of cortisol. So there's this cortisol awakening response that psychologists love to do. And so it's just a few samples immediately after wake up. And indeed, we found more reactivity in the shift workers, suggesting that extra stress. I mean, they have horrendous lives, these truck drivers. It's not social at all. They're away from their families for a long time. They're usually sleeping in their trucks, on roads. It can also be dangerous. There's a lot of drug taking. I mean, you can do a movie about truck drivers in Brazil. They've got a lot of crazy YouTube videos about what truck drivers get up to. So, that is a real niche group, but indeed, we saw that. Coming back to the PNAS paper, which we're really proud of, because all of what we've talked about till now still doesn't really tell us the mechanism of how, shift work creates all these adverse health consequences. We know they exist. We know from the epidemiological data, including, as you said, the UK Biobank, that shift work is not good for your health. It increases these. But quite how it happens, is it one day? Is it 5 years? And what is the process? What triggers what, etc. We still just at the early stages of research here. And the paper that we wrote really gave us a hint of what is going on. And that is, if we think of, we've got this clock in our brain, in the hypothalamus, what we call the master clock, that drives this melatonin rhythm. So this was the first discovered key clock. And now we have all these peripheral clocks in all parts of our body, in the liver, in the heart, in the stomach, in the lungs, everywhere you can think of. And it's a question of, when you do shift work, do they all shift at the same time? Do they all adapt to the night shift at the same time? Or do some shift more quickly than others? And in our paper, we showed that indeed some clocks shift really quickly in response to the changing sleep-wake, feeding, fasting that you undergo when you do shift work. And then some are really sluggish. And the most sluggish clock is the one in our brain. Melatonin and this the clock in the hypothalamus does not shift, and people have shown that for quite a while. You can, for example, it can be up to 5 or 6 days before your master clock has moved to your new shift schedule. We showed that in the oil rig workers. It was about 5 or 6 days of doing nights before it moved to the night shift and was in the appropriate phase position to a night shift. But, we measured metabolite rhythms in blood, and suddenly, after 3 nights of night shift, we had a complete shift in those metabolite rhythms. So some clocks are shifting quickly and some are shifting slowly. And that's what we mean by circadian misalignment. They're not moving together. So they're getting these mixed messages, and you're getting this desynchrony within your body until after a certain length of time, everything is moved to the new time zone if you fly across time zones, or to the new shift schedule if you are in that night shift schedule for long enough. So it can all come together. If you do long enough night shifts, and our oil rig workers were on night shifts for 3 weeks, so they had the opportunity to adapt to the night shift. The problem for example, in our NHS or in nurses working in hospitals, they only end up doing 1, 2, or 3 night shifts. So that isn't enough time for all the clocks to adapt to the new night shift. In fact, the clocks are just getting going, and then they're back to day shift. So they're in a total state of desynchrony most of their lives, because they'll do 1 night shift 1 week, 2 night shifts the next week, and then they'll have some days off, and then they might do 3 nights. So they don't know where their clocks are. They don't know where their liver clock is, their brain clock is, and it's this desynchrony that we really think affects all these other physiological functions that clocks regulate, like metabolism, like immunity and immune function. We haven't really spoken too much about immunity, immune function. Also, the gut clock and how this could affect the microbiome. So, there's a lot of downstream consequences of this desynchrony.
Absolutely. And it's probably worth pointing out that if you look at rig workers, then in many ways they have ideal conditions to adjust to a new shift as quickly as possible, because they have quite tightly controlled like dark cycles, meal schedules, and so on. So if it takes them 5 or 6 days to adjust, then if you're thinking about more familiar shift working contexts like nurses working in hospitals, it's surely going to take them longer. If people want to try and understand how this type of internal circadian misalignment that you're referring to feels, where the master clock is set to one time and maybe the liver clock is set to another time and the gut clock is set to another time, you can think about jet lag. You might have noticed, if you've ever flown across, say, 8 time zones, if you've flown from the UK to the west coast of the US, you might have noticed that the first couple of days you have some gastrointestinal distress, maybe you feel bloated, maybe you're constipated, but quite quickly that resolves. But even after 4 or 5 days, your sleep hasn't fully shifted to the new time zone. You're still sleepy during the day, and you still have some insomnia symptoms at night. And that is largely driven by the fact that your master clock is still probably somewhere on the East Coast. It hasn't fully caught up with the new time zone yet. What do you think about whether there are any adaptations within the circadian systems of shift workers that make them better able to withstand circadian disruption? My impression of the literature, and you know it better than I do, is that there probably aren't substantial adaptations in their circadian systems. They seem to in many ways respond similarly to us non-shift workers, but if anything, they might have better coping strategies, and they might, for example, be better able to maintain their mood during circadian misalignment, whereas those of us who aren't used to that state just feel like we've been hit by a train and feel miserable.
Yeah, this is a great question too. And this is all about what we call tolerance to shift work. Are some people more able to cope with shift work than others? And what might those qualities be? Well, certainly it's also involving tolerance to sleep deprivation. And definitely some people, as your audience will have noticed, some people can stay up much later than others in the evening and then still get up in the morning and go to work and be quite efficient. So we do know that we have people that can cope better with short sleep, and that could be related to, of course, their genetics, possibly their clock genes. We showed very early on, just in one of the clock genes per 3, that if you had a certain genotype of the per3, a short or long repeat region, that there was a difference in how well you coped with sleep deprivation. So just using that as an example. But then we think also that there must be people who better cope with circadian misalignment. So those who better tolerate flying across time zones. Again, we may know people that can fly across many time zones and cope better than others. That could relate to, again, genetics, different clock gene polymorphisms, the speed of your natural clock, whether you have a fast clock or a slow clock, and how that translates into real world. That would be what your chronotype is. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Are you an intermediate? And so I think going forward, I mean, at the risk of, I always feel a bit uncomfortable because we don't want, for example, employees to start interviewing potential shift workers and saying, sorry, we don't want you to do the job because your clock gene polymorphism, doesn't suit shift work. I mean, it's not as simple as that. We wouldn't want that to biomarkers of tolerance to shift work. There's more to it than this, but definitely there are people that cope better with shift work, and it could be, as we say at this physiological level, but also it might have something, as you said, Greg, to do with their lives and their families. Now, if you've got a couple that are both doing shift work, that makes life when you have your days off easier, because the problem of night shift working is you have 2 days off and you resume day work, and all your friends, whether you can also still stay on the night shift when you're having a social weekend, that would be more helpful. So I think it depends on your family circumstances. Your children won't be doing night shift work, so that's harder if you have children. Remember, one of the things we should all remember when we do shift work research and we go into factories and we interview shift workers, we are interviewing the people that have survived. These are what we call the healthy shift worker effect. We are studying and asking people about shift work, the ones who can cope with shift work and who've stayed in the job, rather than those that really couldn't cope early on. They left. They did something else. So we mustn't forget that we might already be looking at quite a selective population.
It's a really good point. And you mentioned lots of things in there that I'd love to pick up on, but I'll just mention a few things. One of them is we do know something about the different factors that make some people more tolerant than others. For example, in general, unsurprisingly, younger people seem to better tolerate shift work than older people because their biology is fundamentally more resilient. People who are more neurotic seem to tolerate shift work worse. People with less flexible sleep-wake times seem to tolerate shift work worse, which brings up the subject of extreme chronotypes who can be quite rigid in their patterns of behavior and less able to shift their sleep-wake schedule. And there are specific sleep-wake disorders, advanced sleep phase syndrome, delayed sleep phase syndrome, in which we see this, and that suggests that these people might really struggle with certain types of shifts. But certainly if we can get to the point at which we can identify people who are likely to better tolerate specific types of shifts, and later on in this conversation, Deborah, we might get to the subject of personalizing shift schedules, because I think that's going to be really important, then I think we're going to be better able to support the health of these people.